I'd like to welcome in now Richard Schoenstein, trial lawyer and legal analyst. Richard, thank you so much for your time on this breaking news. I do want to talk about the civil trial. I want to get into more of the specifics. But first, does this come as a surprise at all to you, considering all of the questions, all of the notes from the jury to the judge? It was, Rich said it may have been as many as 11. And then we also know that the judge dismissed that more serious charge of second-degree manslaughter. So is this in any way a surprise?
It's a little surprising to me just based on what happened on Friday. Remember, the reason the judge dismissed manslaughter is because the jury was hung on that charge, meaning that some of the jurors wanted to convict and some didn't. And the prosecution said, well, let's just get rid of the charge because you needed a decision on it to go to the lesser offense of criminally negligent homicide. So the judge agreed to dismiss manslaughter. So because there were some jurors willing to convict on manslaughter, I'm a little surprised this morning that they acquitted on negligence. You would think if they thought that Daniel Penny had committed reckless, manslaughter, that he was also guilty of negligence. But I'm guessing, Nichole, that it was a small minority of jurors that wanted to convict him and that they simply gave up the fight over the weekend.
To expand upon that just a bit, Richard, again, we know that Penny was acquitted, but there was also this video evidence in the case, and there seemed to be quite a bit of video evidence. What do you think convinced the jury that he was not guilty of negligent homicide, which is what you maybe would have expected?
Well, I think it has to come down to intent. I know that the defense argued cause of death, and I didn't find that argument to be as strong as the other argument. I think it probably comes down to the jury deciding that the defendant didn't intend this result, that what he intended was to protect the train, protect his fellow passengers. And even if he was misguided in that regard, even if he used maybe a little too much force in that regard, they didn't want to hold him criminally accountable for his actions when they felt at its base he had good intentions.
All right, so let's talk about this civil suit. At the end of his reporting there, Rich McHugh made mention of it, said because of it, we may not hear from Daniel Penny himself. Do you think it's likely that we won't hear from him if his defense team does, in fact, come out? And do you think that this civil case will have a different outcome because we know the burden of proof is very different in a civil suit?
Right. Well, if I was his attorney, I would advise him not to comment publicly at all as long as that civil suit was pending, except possibly just to thank the jury and to, express appreciation for justice having been done, assuming that's his position. But I certainly wouldn't let him talk about any of the allegations or any of the specifics in advance of a civil trial. That case goes forward. It is a different burden of proof. They only need a preponderance of the evidence. They don't need beyond the reasonable doubt. And you don't need a unanimous jury in most civil trials. So that is different as well. So that can still go forward. The family can still seek to get something in their favor in the courts against Daniel Penny, and he would be well advised to let his attorneys do the talking in the interim.
And Richard, we know that this has certainly been a highly emotional case. That was evident in what we heard there from, Neely's supporters, the supporters of Neely's family. What do you think happens next as far as the city of New York is concerned, potentially spread out from there? Because we did hear calls for, people to meet up, to make their voices heard in protest.
Yeah, well, I don't blame them for being disappointed. I don't blame them for feeling like the system is stacked against them and that this is yet another result in this direction. I think this case is a little bit different. Daniel Penny was not a police officer. That makes it different than some of these other cases. And, at bottom, Nichole, I always say the jury has the final word. We left it to the good judgment of 12 jurors who obviously worked very, very hard and considered the evidence over a period of days to come to a result. And I may not personally agree with that result. In fact, I don't, but I have to acknowledge that the jurors get the final word here, and I have to respect their decision. There may be protests. This is a volatile issue, and I will say there's no way Jordan Neely should have died on the subway that day. That seems to me to be something that is worth more examination, worth more thought, worth some protest and some doing about. Because that doesn't seem to be something that had to happen.
You know, and I know that law so much depends on what happened before. So my last question for you, do you think this case in any way will set some type of precedent moving forward?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a precedent, you know, in a case like this, but these cases are always so fact specific. This is not a broad authorization of vigilantism. This isn't saying you can just go on a train and strangle anybody who bothers you. Anybody who thinks that that's what this verdict says is wrong. This is a very specific finding about a very specific set of facts. It's disheartening, surely, for the family of the victim, but I wouldn't say it is broad authority to go out and commit acts like this going forward.
Well, we certainly appreciate your input. Trial lawyer
He's here in the studio with us to talk more about this, and Rich McHugh's probably right? If you're Daniel Penny, you don't come out and talk because of that civil litigation that's pending?
Absolutely, Connell. Well, you just want to say thank you to the jury. I'm glad I got the result I did, but he still faces a civil suit. He should not be talking about this substantively at all, and I doubt he will.
What did you make of the actual case here? There have been some in New York. Depends, obviously, what side you're on in all of this, who were critical of the district attorney, Alvin Bragg, for even bringing it. In Bragg's statement, he talks about the fact here that their lengthy deliberation, the jury, and the totality of the facts and evidence underscored why this case was put in front of a jury of Mr. Penny's peers. Is that right, you think?
I think it is right. I didn't have any problem with this case being put in front of a jury. And I know Alvin Bragg faced a lot of criticism. They faced a lot of hurdles to bring this case, to get it in front of a jury. But they did that, and this is what's supposed to happen. We bring in a jury of 12 of his peers. They get to hear the evidence over a long period of time. They get to deliberate the case, which they did over 4 days. They called back a lot of evidence. They had the judge reread some of the instructions. I mean, they did their job, and then they render a verdict. And that verdict goes one way or the other, but it was still a righteous case to bring.
I have a quick clip from Mayor Adams here in New York, who spoke about the verdict earlier. So let me play that, and then we'll come back and talk some more. Here's the mayor.
We have a mental health system that is broken. When you have someone repeatedly going through that system, that's a signature of failure. And we need help in Albany and in the city council. We can't sit back and mourn the loss of someone that is caught up in this system when we're not taking the action every day.
So that's the kind of the politics of it that are in the background of this case, and you wonder how much the jury thought about issues like that as well. I mean, to your earlier point, it's clear they struggled with this. Otherwise, there would have been a unanimous verdict much earlier on the manslaughter charge last week.
That's right. That's right. They did struggle with it, and I was surprised when they were hung on the manslaughter charge on Friday that they would come back in Monday and find him not guilty. That seemed like the least likely verdict as a follow-up to being hung on manslaughter. And very quickly, right? And very quickly. Well, I think what happened is there was a minority of the jury that was for guilty, and probably over the weekend they gave up. They probably came in, the harder charge had been dismissed. The weight of the jury was against them in all those days of deliberations. And I think whoever it was that was going for a conviction probably decided this morning, I'm done. I'm not getting anywhere in these deliberations.
I mean, it could have been one person, right?
It could have been one person. We don't know, and I'm not sure if we ever know. And by the way, that's entirely an appropriate thing to happen in a jury room. That's why we have deliberations. That's why we don't have this decided by one person. We have 12 people. They bring their different views. They bring their life experiences. They debate, they deliberate, and they come up with a verdict.
But in this case, they had an either-or, right? They could have chosen from one charge that would have put him in jail for maximum 15 years,
Yeah.
the manslaughter charge, or this one I think was up to 4 years. What about the way it was constructed? Because you couldn't convict on both.
Right, but it wasn't really an either-or because they had to decide the manslaughter, the higher charge, first.
Right.
And that was the struggle on Friday. They were hung on manslaughter, and the defense said the whole case is a hung jury, and the prosecution, they took a gamble. They said, we'll dismiss the higher charge so we can get to a jury decision on negligence. That was a gamble by the prosecution, and they lost.
You know, final thing they did, what would you say to people? I mean, it's fine for us to sit around and talk and think theoretically and about this and for you to explain all the legalities of it to people who are, and there are always going to be people, especially in a case that's this highly charged, that are upset with this verdict and think, you know what, here we go again. The system is stacked against us. We heard some of that outside the courthouse today. What do you say to that?
I totally understand that. You know, there's a chain of cases like this where minorities are the victims and non-minorities seem to be the defendants. Most of them happen with police officers. This is an odd one where it's a civilian and a minority defendant. I totally understand people being upset about that, and their right to be, and they can protest and talk about it. And the one thing I agree with Mayor Adams, who I don't always agree with, is the mental health issue needs focus.
Right.
There is no reason that Jordan Neely should have died on that subway that day. No reason.
Yep. Yeah, it's a tragic case, no matter what. And today we did get the verdict, not guilty. Thank you, Rich. Thank you for coming in.
My pleasure.